say that it's a real pleasure. I've known Becky Irwin for a number of years professionally, and we've been in a lot of different meetings together. She works on plant-pollinator interactions, but she dabs into the chemical world as well, and I work on plant herbivore questions, and I dab into the chemical world. So we've had sort of a mutual interest, and it's really nice to sort of think about these questions from different angles. And her work on pollinators is really timely in today's world where we're really facing a lot of pollinator decline. I seem to remember a conversation with you a few years back where you said that in some places it's hard to find your bumblebees anymore because they're really declining. So there are some real issues that we're trying to wrestle with. So with that, thank you for making the trek down from Dartmouth and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us.
All right. Yes. I think I can do it. All right, there's too much here. Sorry, guys. There we go.
Good.
Good? I think I'm good. If this thing flies off, I'll just grab it. Okay. I'm going to have to fuss with this for a second. Great. So thank you so much, as I mess with this, for having me here today. Here, I come with this. And what I'm going to do today is share with you some work that we've been doing on invasive plants and trying to understand more interdisciplinary approaches to understand both the causes of invasive species as well as some solutions for invasive species management. And so when we look across the landscape, I think we notice that humans are really noteworthy in both altering the landscape and moving species around. And we oftentimes have to go into even our own backyards to see that. So this is an image from Colorado, and what you'll notice here are a bunch of beautiful flowering plants, of which none of them are native. So this pink one here is a non-native thistle. This white one here is a non-native daisy. And invasive species are now considered a leading component of environmental change, and in some areas are a driver of biodiversity loss. And so some of the pressing issues associated with invasive species are, first of all, understanding the causes of invasive species, the consequences of these invaders when they move into new regions, and then solutions for invasive species management, and in particular, more sustainable solutions. Oh, I think I can use this. And so what I'd like to do today is share with you 3 things that we've been doing trying to understand causes, consequences, and solutions. So first we'll ask what factors affect the susceptibility of communities to invasions. And to do so, we'll use a modeling approach, and we'll try and combine both economics and ecology to try and understand where we have invasive species and potentially why. We'll then move to more of an empirical approach, a field-based approach to look at consequences. So once we have invasive species in an area, how do these invaders affect native communities and ecosystem services? And then finally, we'll move to solutions and thinking about how we can combine economics and ecology again to inform invasive species management. And so this first approach and the third approach will involve more modeling and theoretical questions, and then this middle approach will be a field-based approach. Let's jump right in. So in thinking about the causes of invasive species, I think we have a few pressing things we want to understand. So first of all, we want to understand which communities are most susceptible to species invasions. And then if we can identify those communities that are most susceptible to invasion, can we identify causal factors that are linked to invasion? So mechanistic factors that seem to be linked to invasion. And a number of studies have tried to look at the relationship between human population size and invasive species. So the notion that as you have more humans in the landscape, you might find a correlation with more invasive species. And people have definitely found that relationship with birds as well as fish and plants in the US and the UK. But what I want to try and convince you of today is that there are important things that humans do in the landscape that might provide better predictive insight into which communities are more susceptible to species invasions. And the more mechanistic insight that I want to try and describe to you today are economic activities that humans have on the landscape and how that links to species invasions. And so to kind of give you an analogy to what I'm talking about, when people try and correlate human population size with invasive species, for example, we oftentimes see this relationship. So if you look at the relationship between state population size and the number of exotic plants on the y-axis, what you see is some positive relationship. And I don't think any of us would argue it's simply a function of humans breathing and just being there that's driving invasive species. Instead, it's probably some function of what humans are doing in the landscape that's affecting invasive species. And in a similar vein, if you look at the relationship between world population size and atmospheric CO2, you see this nice positive relationship. Ditto, it's not a function of us having more humans and breathing that's affecting world CO2, it's what we're doing in the landscape. So industrialization, the burning of fossil fuels. And so what we'd like to argue then is that what we need are some mechanistic insights into what these humans and what human population size mechanistically is doing to the landscape and how that's affecting the number of exotic plants in our case. And so our hypothesis is that when combined, ecological properties and economic activities can predict the number of exotic plants in an ecosystem. And so the reason why we're really interested in ecological properties, economic properties or activities, is that usually economic activities provide a fairly good indication of human activity, and they're really linked to kind of the things that might be related to invasive organisms. And so in particular, things like disturbance to the landscape, the movement of things either through transportation or the movement of people or goods throughout the landscape, and then the importation of goods, and with it potential organisms as well. And so those economic activities may be linked to human population size as well, but also the importation and release of exotic organisms. And so if we think about causal pathways of species invasions, we can think about them along a continuum from factors that might be ultimately linked to species invasions to more factors that might be more proximally linked to species invasions. And so you might envision things like human population size may be an ultimate driver of invasions, but that human population size may be associated with economic activities that might be more proximately linked to factors such as propagule pressure or the number of propagules invading into an area that's directly driving invasions. Things like propagule pressure we can never get a good estimate of, and so instead something like economic activity is something that most nations measure, including the US, and it's something that we can readily get an estimate of. In addition, you may have ecological factors that are more ultimately linked to species invasions, such as latitude, as well as more proximate mechanisms such as the number of natives that could provide biotic resistance to invasion. And so it's probably some mixture of these human and economic factors along with these ecological factors that are driving invasions. And so what we want to do then is develop predictive models that combine both of these types of factors. And so our approach in doing so was to try and confront models with data, and then to test among competing a priori models. And so the data we use, this is an image of North America here, or of the United States, sorry, here, and it's kind of, it's hard to see, but the reason why I show it is that the data we used was the number of exotic and native plants in the 50 US states, and it came from a program called the Biota of North America program that has these data available for both US states as well as at the county level. We used population level data from the US Census Bureau, and then economic data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So initially what we wanted to ask is, if we look at the relationship between the number of exotic plants, population size, and economic data, do we see any sort of relationship? And in asking these questions, we also want to think about what estimates of economic activity might be very important in driving invasions. And so in particular, there are certain aspects of economic activity that might be strongly linked to invasions, and some of those estimates, as I mentioned, might be things that are associated with disturbance to the landscape and the importation of propagules. So things, for example, related to economic activity associated with real estate development might be very strongly linked to invasive species, for example. As a first stab at trying to understand the relationship between economic activity and the number of exotic plants, we first looked at the relationship between total state gross domestic product and the number of exotic plants, and you see this nice positive relationship. It's important to note that in most developed countries, your total estimate of GDP is also a function of population size, and so if you then look at the per capita estimate of state GDP as a function of the number of exotics, you actually see no relationship. And so this relationship here is solely being driven by population size. And so what we suspect is happening here is there's probably a lot of things associated with the total state's GDP that has nothing to do with the number of exotics. So things like the cosmetic industry, like I can envision no way that that would be related to exotic plants, for example. And you can imagine other things within GDP that would also have no relationship to exotics. So what we then did was narrow down, looking at our relationships to looking at how economic activity associated with real estate development might be linked to exotics. And so first of all, looking at the bottom graph, if we look at the total real estate, and I converted it to GSP, this is gross state product, on a per kilometer squared basis as a function of the number of exotic plants, we see a positive relationship. And then if we divide this by the state population size and look at the per capita real estate GSP, we now also see a positive relationship. So suggesting that the number of exotic plants increases as you increase your real estate GSP. So we have a little bit of predictive power here. So given this relationship, what we then wanted to do is test two competing models. And so in our first competing model, what we wanted to argue, and we call it the population model, is that in this model, we would find a positive relationship between population size and the number of exotics. And we wanted to compare this population model and how well it fit the observed data to what we're calling our exotic economic model. And so the main difference between these two models is that instead of having a direct link from population size to the number of exotics, we instead have an indirect link mediated through this real estate activity. So what humans are doing to the landscape in this case. We also have some ecological variables in the model as well. The first one, and all of the ecological variables are the same between the two models. The first one we have is union. So this is the date that a state entered into the union. And so you might envision that this might be correlated with disturbance to the landscape. The more older historic states, especially those on the East Coast, may have had longer human-mediated disturbance, for example. And then we also have other ecological variables, such as latitude. So we have well-known relationships between a latitude and what you envision would be species richness, or the number of species you would have. So as you decline in latitude and go towards the equator, you gain more species. And so we want to include that ecological information in there. And then in addition, we have the number of natives in our model as well. And so we do so for two reasons. First, we want to test whether there's any biotic resistance associated with having natives present. So if you have more natives present, does that help the community resist invasive species? Or alternatively, there are some hypotheses to suggest that when you have more natives present, you actually see increased numbers of invaders. And so the natives present help facilitate more invaders moving in, so your biodiversity hotspots get even richer in terms of biodiversity. And so we used path analysis in combination with structural equation modeling to test how well these two competing models fit our observed data. And so simply what path analysis does, it looks at the correlation structure that exists in your observed data and tests how well it matches your predicted correlation structure here. And definitely ask questions. Number of different species, and so it's all in terms of species richness. We would love to get like extent of ground cover, which you probably could across all species, but we couldn't then decipher how many species we'd have. It would just be total cover. And then it'd be hard to decipher which were native and what proportion was native versus invasive. Yeah, so it's just total number of species. And then, sorry, one other thing to note. So in these models, the straight arrows here mean that there's some sort of direct effect. When we have one arrow going to another variable to another arrow, those mean that there are indirect effects. And then finally, these arrows that are double-headed here mean that there's simple correlations among variables. And so for each of our models, we wanted to test how well each model fit the data, and then we want to compare whether one model provided a better fit than the other. And so first of all, for our population model, looking down here at the bottom, so we have this goodness of fit test, and in this case, a non-significant p-value is good, so it means that your model does not differ from your observed data. We'll talk about the AIC value in a minute. It doesn't mean a lot, so we can compare it to something else. But with this population model, we can explain about 60% of the variation in the number of exotic species we have in the 50 US states. And so a few things to note. First of all, our hatched arrows or dashed arrows denote negative effects. The solid arrows denote positive effects. And then the width of the arrow represents its magnitude of explanatory power. And then finally, we have these little U's here, which simply represent unexplained variation. And so with the population model, we see a strong positive relationship, as we would predict, between human population size and the number of exotics. And then a few other things to know. As you would expect, as you decline in latitude, you pick up more exotic species, and we would expect to see that finding. And then the other thing that's interesting here is that as you increase the number of natives, you see a reduction in the number of exotics, suggesting that the communities that are more biodiverse do provide some biotic resistance. And then finally, this one's a little counterintuitive, but when you have older states, so states that entered into the Union and did so much longer ago, they receive more have more exotic plants. And so this Union date is your older Union dates have more exotic organisms. And so this is our population model. And so with our AIC value, just keep track of this model. And so when we're comparing models that have significantly lower AIC values by at least 2 units provide typically a better fit to the data. And so with our exotic economic model, our AIC value did decline by greater than 2 units. This model still provides a good fit to the data, and we can explain about 70% of the variation in the number of exotics. And we would expect to be able to explain more variation in the number of exotics because we've made our model more complex. You've added another parameter. But your AIC value takes into account that model complexity, and so even though we get a penalty for making our model more complex, it still explains, or it still provides a better fit to the data. And so the important points here are that now human population size has an indirect effect on the number of exotics mediated through real estate economic activity. So what we then wanted to do is we can take this model that's parameterized with US data and take the structural equations from it to try and predict the number of exotic plants in other nations. So what we did was we combed the literature and found as many examples as we could from both developed and developing nations, which had estimates of the number of native species and the number of exotic species. And it was a lot more challenging to do than we actually expected. Nations just don't typically have this information available. And in particular, we needed nations that categorized exotic organisms in the same way. So these organisms had to be exotic to either the island or to the continent, because that's how the data we had categorized exotics. And so what we wanted to do here is ask how well our model did at predicting the number of exotics in these other places. And so here were all of either the countries, or with Canada, we could get all of a bunch of information about provinces that had information on native and exotic species. On the right here is the observed number of exotic plants in these different locations. And in the middle here are the predicted number of exotic plants based on our model. And then in brackets here is a prediction, or you could think of like a confidence interval. And so in all but 2 of our cases, so in 85% of our cases, our model was able to predict the number of exotic plants in these other provinces or nations, except for in 2 examples. And in both of these examples, our model over-predicted the number of exotic plants compared to the observed values. So in Alberta, as well as in Puerto Rico. I don't have a very good explanation for why our model over-predicted the number of exotics in Alberta. The thing you should take into, or should note though, is that this model is parameterized with US data. And so as a consequence, if the US has a lot higher economic activity, for example, than Alberta, you might predict some sort of, or suspect that you might find some sort of over-prediction with our model. In addition, a similar pattern with Puerto Rico. Our model over-predicted the number of exotics. And with Puerto Rico, you could make the argument, and especially with maybe potentially some developing nations, is that, again, because our model is parameterized with US data, if you have nations that are having increased economic activity, it could provide some suggestion that as you increase economic activity, you might find more susceptibility to exotic organisms. And so our model may be predicting that. And so to conclude this portion of the talk, what I hope I've convinced you of, at least initially, is that we can think about drivers of exotic organisms from very ultimate factors to those that are more proximate. And by having a simple model that included some ecological factors as well as human population size and economic activity, we could predict about 70% of the variation in the number of exotic plants in the 50 US states. And so hopefully it then supports the notion that economic activities can be drivers of exotic organisms, but also we might want to consider economic activities as well when we consider solutions to invasive species management. And we'll come back to that idea later in the presentation. Okay, so moving along to consequences. We now know that we have invasive species in the landscape, and we might want to ask what some of the consequences of those invasive species are. And what we're going to look at is how invasive species affect native communities and ecosystem services. And the ecosystem services we're going to focus on are pollination services, so pollination to native plants. And we're going to ask how invasive plants in the landscape affect pollination to native plants. The reason why I'm particularly interested in pollination, but why we in general should be interested in it, is that about 90% of our flowering plants rely on insects or other animals for pollination. So it's an important natural service that we get from wild organisms. And then just from a purely biodiversity standpoint, both plants and insects provide a significant portion of world biodiversity. And so it's nice to understand how non-native organisms are affecting that component of biodiversity. And so let's transport ourselves from rainy New England to sunny Colorado. And this work was done outside of about 6 hours west of Denver, Colorado, at a place called the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and it's outside of Crested Butte, Colorado. These are some fairly pristine habitats, but nonetheless, even in these habitats, there are non-native organisms, including this plant, Linaria vulgaris, or butter and eggs. It's yellow toadflax. Many of you may recognize it from around here. So this plant was originally introduced from, Europe/Eurasia, probably at least 200 to 250 years ago. There were accidental introductions, and there have been some introductions that were on purpose as well. So people use this plant. You can boil a plant and then drink the extract, and it helps kind of with liver function, and that's at least the herbal part of it. And also people planted this plant as well because it's fairly showy looking, and so it looks nice in gardens. You can actually still buy the seeds online, even though it's non-native. So around here, it's a little wimpy, diminutive kind of weed. It never does that well. In the western U.S., it forms fairly dense and thick stands. It can grow to be about waist high. Around here, it never gets to be more than about that high. And on most state noxious weed lists in the western U.S. and in the Rocky Mountain West, this plant is listed. And so if you have it on your property, you are required to remove it. And so because it exists here, we want to ask then, to what effect is it affecting these native ecosystems? And so moving back, just to give you a little bit of the natural history of this plant. And so it's an obligate outcrosser. And so it has flowers. It requires insects, and in particular bees, for pollination. A single stalk like this can produce about 6,000 seeds. And then this plant can also reproduce clonally. So a lot of the stems that you see in this patch here were probably clonal stems. Once a plant goes from a seedling to a vegetative rosette, in its first year of growth, it can produce about 250 stalks. And so it's fairly vigorous, growing vegetatively. And then a genet can produce about 30,000 seeds. So between that vegetative growth and then the seed production, it's a fairly extreme invader. On a per meter squared basis, early in invasion history, you can get about 10 stalks per meter squared. Once sites become fairly infested with this non-native plant, you can have infestation levels of up to 400 stalks per meter squared. And so it takes over. Nonetheless, even though it makes up most of your biomass in an area that's invaded, you still typically have native species holding on. And so you don't see a huge decline in the number of native species you have, but you see a decline in their evenness. So what we wanted to ask then early in the invasion process, when you start to have these invasive stocks moving in, what effect does it have on pollination services to native plants? So you might imagine that this plant is competing for native plants for underground resource competition. That's probably the case. In addition, though, plants may receive a double whammy in that they're also competing with this native plant for pollinators. In these habitats, the vast majority of native plants require insects or other animals for pollination, and these are subalpine habitats, and for whatever reason, historically or evolutionarily, most of the native plant species do not have a seed bank, and so they require seeds for subsequent recruitment. And so if you envision, or if you might hypothesize that there are at least 3 different ways or scenarios by which invasive plants could affect native plants. First of all, there could simply be no change. Second, if we're thinking about interactions among invaders and how they're affecting native flower-visitor interactions, you might envision that the presence of invasive plants might increase visitation to native plants through facilitation. So you have this showy invader present. That invader lures more insects or more pollinators into an area, and then those pollinators spill over and pollinate your native plants. You could also envision a case where your invasive plant decreases visitation to your native plants. So in that case, you have this invasive plant present. It's very showy. All the pollinators go to it and not to your native plants. And so those are 3 different competing hypotheses for how invasive plants could affect pollination of native plants. And we might envision that not all flower-visitor interactions are going to respond in the same direction or with equal magnitude to the same invader. So there's a variety of native plants that co-occur with Linaria. And so these are some examples here. So we have these plants along the top are primarily bumblebee pollinated, and they occur in a diversity of different families, such as the rose family, the aster family, and this is a Jacob's ladder in the Polymonaceae. And then we have plants down here that are pollinated by other types of things, such as flies, hummingbirds, and hawk moths. So you might envision, depending on the type of pollinator that you have, whether it's bumblebees or whether it's other types of visitors, that might affect the degree to which this invasive plant affects pollination of native plants. And so going into this research, we had some a priori hypothesis that we thought we would find, at least for native plants that were sharing pollinators with the invasive plant, that we would find competition for the pollinators. And there were 3 patterns that suggested that we might find that. So first of all, if we look at the relationship between bloom time in the season, so this is Julian week number, and so this is about June, and the number of flowers per meter squared. When you have sites with the invasive plant present, once it really starts to bloom, there are a lot of flowers per meter squared in those sites, relative to native sites that do not have the invasive plant present. This peak in flower abundance is solely being driven by the presence of the invader. And so if we look at these same sites and just remove all of those flowers that are being produced by the invader, you see really no difference between the number of native flowers per meter squared between sites with and without the invader. So the invader is probably luring insects in because these sites probably would be very attractive if they had all those flowers. In addition, which is fairly fascinating, is that the invader has nectar that's very rewarding relative to native species. So here's our invader, Linaria vulgaris. I can't remember if I said the scientific name. I apologize if I didn't. And then on the y-axis is the percent sugar concentration. And so what we find here is that Linaria makes way more sugar in its nectar on a per volume basis than any other native that we've measured. The most closely related native species to this yellow toadflax in these ecosystems is this penstemon. It's in a similar plant family, and even this penstemon produces significantly lower volumes of sugar in its nectar relative to the invader. And so the sugar on a per volume basis is more rewarding, so the sugar in the nectar. And then interestingly, on a per flower basis, Linaria produces significantly more pollen grains per flower than does any other native plant that we've measured. And then if we look at the protein content in the pollen, so most foraging insects are after both nectar and pollen from flowers. And so if you look at the protein content, Linaria as well produces significantly more protein in its pollen. And so here are 3 patterns then. These sites with the invader have a lot of flowers, it has a lot of sugar that bees might want, and then it also has a lot of protein and pollen that bees might want. And so you might expect then that bees may be attracted to these sites, and they may be more attracted to the invasive plant than the native plant. So we wanted to test that. So we've done a variety of different experiments, and I'll just share with you one flavor of the ones that we've done today. So we had sites where either Linaria was present. So when I say invader, it's present. This picture is a little washed out, but here are invasive stalks here, or the Linaria stalks. And then sites where we experimentally clipped out the invader. And so the reason why we did that is we wanted to have all of that below ground resource competition present. So if this invader was competing with natives, say for water or for other nutrients, we wanted to allow that competition still to occur. But then we've removed the blossoms of the invasive plant. And so now here you just have native plants present. Here you have those natives and the invasive plant present. And we want to look at visitation rates by pollinators to these different sites, as well as seed production of our native plants. What we then did was we observed our pollinators, and we typically categorize them into a few simple functional groups, either our bumblebees, which are fairly common pollinators in this region, flies, solitary bees, so our bumblebees are social, we have solitary bees, and then a mixture of hummingbirds and hawk moths. And we did things like, first of all, observing the number of visits our sites received, so at the site level, and then we did separate observations where we observed simple visitation to the native plants only, so not to the invader, but to the natives. So first of all, looking at visitation to sites. So on the y-axis we have the mean total visits per site, so areas where the area is present, and I say pulled here, we either pull or clip off blossoms, the roots are still present, or sites where we've removed Linaria. And so what we find, first of all, is areas where you have Linaria, they have about 50% higher visitation rates than areas where you don't. So it's suggesting that pollinators are being lured into these areas. The vast majority of our pollinators are bumblebees, and then to a lesser extent, flies, solitary bees, and hummingbirds. And so if we break this visitation down to the guild of visitors that we have, we find that Linaria is primarily bumblebee pollinated, and lo and behold, when you have Linaria present, those sites receive significantly more visits by bumblebees. And then also, bizarrely, they receive significantly more visits by hummingbirds. So hummingbirds will visit Linaria out of desperation. It's not a typical hummingbird pollinated flower, but they will visit it. And then we find no difference in solitary bees. The vast majority of solitary bees are too small to pry open the lip of Linaria to get in the flower, to get the nectar or the pollen. And then with flies, we see the actual opposite pattern. And so again, they are typically too small to get into the flowers of Linaria. And so we suspect that what's going on here is sites that have a lot of Linaria aren't particularly attractive to them. And so they're going to more sites with, that don't have that visual display of Linaria present. So now we want to focus on, we see areas that have Linaria have more insects coming in, but are those insects just going to Linaria, or are they also going to native plants? And so we do separate observations within those sites on our native flowering community. And so what we find is the opposite pattern here for at least some of our visitors. So with our number of bumblebee visits, and so these are raw numbers, these analyses come from things that have there are other covariates in there to kind of remove some of this variation. And so that's what the asterisks are coming from. But what you'll see here then is that when you clip Linaria out and you just look at visitation to native plants, your native plants are receiving more visitation where they're growing without the invader compared to where they're growing with it. So it's suggesting that Linaria is luring away our bumblebee pollinators. Our pattern for hummingbirds is no longer significant. We still see no difference in solitary bees, and then we still see the same pattern for flies. And so flies are visiting significantly more native plants without the invader compared to where it's present. We can then ask, how do these differences in visitation rate then actually translate into seed production? So what we would suspect then is that in areas where you've removed the invader, you'd predict to find that your native plants should have higher fruit and seed production compared to where it's present. And so we categorized our plants into those that were either bumblebee pollinated, and that's what's shown here. And so I'm just showing 3 different examples. We have our potentilla, Heliomeris, and Polemonium. These are all primarily bumblebee pollinated. They do receive visitation to a lesser extent by other visitors. And I'm just going to show you data for one example, and I've just pulled out Polemonium. What we did was we measured seed set of Polemonium in these plots, and we've also done hand pollination experiments, but I won't have a chance to show you those today. In general, what we find then is on the y-axis is Polemonium seed production per fruit, and then for our linearia present sites and where we clip it out. And then over here on the right, what we have are estimates of how good each visitor is on a per flower basis at pollinating our native plant. So bumblebees are the most common pollinators. They are also the most effective pollinators, and these are the pollinators that Linearia is sharing with this native plant. So as we would suspect, this invasive plant's luring pollinators away from the native plant. You find not only increased visitation where you remove the blossoms, but also increased seed set. We've done pollen supplementation experiments as well, and we find increased pollen limitation as well where you have Linearia present. However, we may not expect to find the same pattern for all native organisms. So we do have some native flowering species that aren't bumblebee pollinated. This flax, for example, this is blue flax or linum. It's primarily fly pollinated, and so it doesn't really share pollinators with Linearia. And then we have the scarlet gilia or Icomopsis, and it's primarily hummingbird pollinated. And we found really no difference in hummingbird pollination to native plants only. So again, you might expect to find no difference in seed production for linum, say, and maybe even no difference for Icomopsis. So we measured seed production here as well. Even though Linearia or linum is primarily fly pollinated, bumblebees will visit it upon occasion, and they're fairly effective pollinators. But as we suspected, when we measured seed production per fruit for linum, we saw no difference between sites where Linearia was present compared to where we clipped it out. And then strangely for Icomopsis, we found the complete opposite pattern. So again, even though Icomopsis is primarily hummingbird pollinated, bumblebees do a fairly good job at pollinating it as well. But for Icomopsis, what we find is that where Linearia is present, we find significantly more seeds per plant compared to where it's clipped out. And so kind of the opposite pattern, which was surprising to us. And the reason why we think that we're seeing this opposite pattern here is that Icomopsis also experiences nectar robbing by a bumblebee, and so these are bees that steal nectar from flowers without pollinating. And so where it actually co-occurs with Linearia, the invasive plant actually lures away these nectar robbers that are stealing nectar, and as a consequence, Icomopsis is actually getting higher visitation rates in the presence of the invader. And so that's this bizarre case where you actually see a positive effect of the invader on a native plant. But it goes to show that not all native plants are going to respond in the same way to the same invader. So now we've thought a little bit about the consequences of species invasions in native ecosystems. Now let's think a little bit about solutions. And so given at least that we have some invasive species that do have negative effects on native species in the ecosystems in which we invade, we might want to understand how to manage them. So at the beginning of the talk, we suggested that economic activities might be associated with susceptibility of communities to invasion. So can we actually use economic activities to help manage invasive species as well? And so that's where this question comes from. And so we were particularly interested in thinking about invasive species management across a social landscape. So if you envision, especially in native or in systems around here, we all have neighbors, and our neighbors do things to their property that sometimes we like and sometimes we don't like. And one of the things that we share with our neighbors are seeds, typically, as well as pollen. But oftentimes you have seeds, native seed as well as non-native seed that can be moving among your neighbors. And so if you envision you have property owner 1, property owner 2, each of these properties has a bunch of non-native organisms or exotic organisms on there. And they're going to be sharing seed movement and invasive spread movement among these different properties. And so how you manage the invaders on your property may affect the degree to which your neighbor can manage their invaders as well. And so with that in mind, you can envision that there might be two ways then to think about invasive species management. In the one case, you could have property owners working together collectively to manage their invaders. And so in this case, property owners are realizing that they are both receiving propagules or receiving seed, for example, from their neighbors, and they are donating seed to their neighbors. So how they manage their invasives is going to affect their neighbors and subsequent dispersal back to their own property. So they recognize that you have these feedback loops. And so collective management says that owners work cooperatively to control invaders, because that potentially could provide a better management strategy. Alternatively, property owners could manage their invaders independently. So in this case, they ignore the notion that there's invasive plant spread among different properties, and instead, they just have management decisions that are based solely as a function of the number of invaders on their property alone. And they don't take into account the fact that you could have spread from one property to another. So with that in mind, we wanted to develop a bioeconomic model that asks the degree to which collective management of invasive species versus independent management of invasive species might provide better eradication of invaders across the landscape. And so our model included both aspects of the ecology of organisms as well as economic aspects of the environment. And so it included the number of invasive plants we have. And so in this case, we're now talking not about species, but we have one invasive plant species and the number of individuals you have of that species. So we're moving from a community level to a population level. And so we have invasive plants present, and we have removal of those invaders across the landscape, so we assume that we can remove the invaders. We have native plants present, and we assume that one way we can control invaders is not just by removing them, but by also planting more natives. So again, that notion that if you have more natives, it might outcompete the invasives. And so these are ecological components in the model. We also have economic components. We assume that there's some sort of economic benefits resulting from natives. Those are often hard to quantify, but nonetheless, we assume that maybe our natives reduce erosion, maybe they're very important in aesthetics, maybe it helps increase our property values. We assume that there's some economic damages resulting from invaders, and then we assume that there's some economic or financial costs incurred from whatever management decision you decide to use. So if you're removing invaders, there's going to be some financial costs that you have to pay to remove them. In addition, if you're planting natives, there's some financial costs you have to pay. And so we used a dynamic optimization approach to solve the optimal number of invasives removed and natives planted over time that generated the largest net economic benefit. So our benefits in this case are not measured in ecological currency, they're measured in economic dollars. And we did so for collective management and independent management. And so this is just a quick theoretical outcome, first of all. And so on the y-axis, we have the number of invaders removed over time on the x-axis for our collective management that's hatched and independent management, the solid line. And so what we find very quickly early on is that with collective management, property owners realize that they want to overmanage early on because they realize not only that they have invasive species on their property, but they want to overmanage to take into account the fact that they're receiving invasive species from their neighbor's property as well. So you see a higher rate in invasive plant removal initially, or invasive removal initially, and they eradicate that invader earlier on in time compared to individuals managing independently. What you could then do, for example, is, so it suggests that collective management provides better management than independent as a management scenario. You could either levy a penalty to encourage people that are managing independently to manage collectively, or you could levy some sort of subsidy as an encouragement. So either you could tax them or you could give them a subsidy. Whatever you do, the goal is to try and encourage people to work collectively. So given this theoretical outcome, we then wanted to ask, okay, let's take our model and use empirical data to actually parameterize it. And we did so using Veneria vulgaris. It's a fairly common weed, as we've talked about in the West. It has fairly common natural history properties that match other types of weeds, and so we figured it was a good model. And so we used economic data that was either specific to Linaria or specific to the Rocky Mountain West. And then we used ecological data that we had collected that was specific to this species. And so what we wanted to do was solve the optimal management strategy where you maximize your net benefits. And we did so across a range of Linaria densities. So if you go out in nature, you see different ranges of infestation. And so what type of management strategy should you use depending on the level of infestation that you have on your property? And so our finding, and then I'll show you some figures, is that the optimal management strategy varied as a function of the amount of infestation you have. And so just ignore this down here for a minute. We'll talk about it. First of all, let's look at our low density. So if we have plots, for example, that are early in the invasion process that have about 5 Linaria stems per meter squared, and if you look at the number of Linaria per meter squared and then the removal of that Linaria over time, and so our time is in time steps of years, and then the the dark lines are the collective management, and then your solid lines are the invader, and then your dark line is the invader, and then your less dark line, the gray line, is the, I got it backwards, sorry. The solid lines are your invader, the hatched lines are your natives. And so what we can find, at least early in the invasion process, is that the collective management and the independent management lines are right on top of each other. It doesn't matter what type of management scenario you use. What it suggests is as long as you start removing the invaders, there's so few there, you can just eradicate them quickly, and you can eradicate them in about 2 years. And as a consequence, you see this increase in natives over time. And so when you look at this removal rate, you eradicate them quickly, they're gone. And so what it suggests is we don't have to worry about collective or independent management early in the invasion process. Instead, what you should probably be doing is putting any sort of money that you have towards management strategies into education. And so you should be educating people about non-native species on their property and to eradicate them as fast as they can when they notice them. Alternatively, though, in many properties we see very high densities of infestation, and that's where the type of management strategy that occurs is important for removing the invaders. So first of all, if you look at collective management, with collective management, what we find is that by property owners working together, they remove the invader. After about 6 years, you see a higher removal rate initially relative to this independent management, and you see a concomitant increase in the number of natives. With independent management, you'll notice down here that there's lower removal rates initially in the number of invaders. And so they're removing invaders, you see a decline in the number of invaders, but they're also starting to receive invaders from their neighbor's property as well, and they can't keep up with the number that they're receiving. And as a consequence, you basically have a certain area where the property owner gives up because the economic benefits that they're getting from the removal are exceeded by the costs. And so the consequence, they give up, and you then see a leveling off of the number of natives, and it will actually start to decline as we increase the scenario out. So what you then want to do is, in these scenarios where you have very high densities of the invasive, you want to actually encourage these property owners who are managing their invasive weeds independently to manage collectively. And you can do so either using a stick or a carrot. We did the stick approach, and we said, fine, let's levy a penalty, or if you want to use tax, you could use that word too. Let's just call it a penalty. Let's levy a penalty that encourages our property owners to manage not independently but collectively. So we can do that over time. And so what you see is as the property owners start managing collectively, you see a decline in that tax over time until all of the invasive plants are removed. This is calculated on a per meter squared basis. If you actually calculated this on a per acre basis, it would be an astronomically high tax. And so it would be impossible to actually do this. Instead, though, on someone's entire property, you could actually levy the tax around the person's property boundary, because that's the area where you have to most worry about spread of invasives from one property to the next. And if you do so, it's actually a tax that's within the realm, or a penalty within the realm of what could be levied on someone to encourage them to work collectively. And then the final thing that we did was asked how sensitive our model was to changes in, for example, if we provide a subsidy to remove invasive plants, or if we provide a tax to remove invasive plants, what sorts of economic incentives could we use to encourage invasive plant removal? And the one thing that the model suggested is that providing a subsidy for invasive plant removal could provide the greatest benefits in terms of removal across the landscape. So very briefly then, to summarize, we had 3 different components here in terms of causes. What I hope that I convinced you of is that the actions of humans measured in terms of economic activity can provide predictive insight into the susceptibility of communities to invasion. In terms of consequences, our invasive plant did have some negative effects on native plants through changes in pollination, but not all native plants were affected in the same way and with the same magnitude. And then finally, economic policies could potentially encourage invasive species management across the social landscape. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks so much.
I love bumblebees. Does this plant have any positive effects on the health, size, or number of bumblebee colonies?
Yep, and so I'll repeat the question because the gentleman asked me to before. So the question was, does the invasive plant have any beneficial effects on pollinators, and in particular bumblebees? The answer is yes. So I didn't show you that data, maybe I should have. So we have a whole separate project where we've gone through and looked at how the invasive plant affects native pollinators themselves. And so not only do you see just increased visitation rates, but we've used genetic approaches as well, and it suggests that in areas where you have the invasive plant present, you see increased colony numbers, so increased colony density, and then the sizes of those colonies on a per colony basis are bigger as well. And so there is a benefit to having the invasive plant present. And it's not just a function of having more flowers. I think that's the main causal driver in the natural landscape. But if you even do feeding experiments in the lab, because it makes the invasive plant makes more protein in its pollen, if you feed it to bees, it actually increases larval development and larval number as well. And so there are benefits. And then everyone wants to remove this invasive plant. So we've done experiments, for example, working with the BLM, where they've removed it from the landscape. And so what you find is when you remove the plant from the landscape, the native plants that have moved back in are extremely pollen limited because there's no bees, because the bees have taken off. So.
I'm wondering a little more about the distinction between invasive and non-native, whether they're synonymous, and also there's like a time period definition for when something's native versus invasive, and about like maybe the connotation of it's like I feel like a lot of people think invasive species are automatically like a negative thing, but if there's like something you come out with educational material that they can be like neutral or positive.
That's a fascinating question. So the question was about the terminology that we use for non-native organisms, and you noticed I was very lax, and I called in an area everything under the sun, probably from exotic to non-native to invasive. And there's a whole literature that's interesting about what we should call these organisms. And so you can have native organisms that you would call invasive. So typically, the term invasive is oftentimes used for something that has really high population growth rates. And it can actually be a native organism as well. And so it could be something that's going through a range expansion. Still native, but it's actually invading into a new region. And so oftentimes, and most of the hubbub about non-native organisms have been associated with organisms that have made a huge jump dispersal, going from, say, one continent to the next. And so I should probably call an area an exotic invasive would be the term that would be best used, because it's exotic to the continent and it's also spreading rapidly. And so that would be the best terminology for the organism I study. For something like dandelion, it's non-native. It's been here for so long, I would call it naturalized.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Jungian time period you were talking about.
And so some of the things, so dandelion in our data set comes up as an exotic organism. Some people probably, I think everyone in here knows that if you'd ask someone just off the street whether dandelion was native or not, they would say it was native. The other classic example would be honeybees. And so the honeybees are now all over the news, and so people may have general sense more if you ask someone off the street, but most people would have said a honeybee was native, and it's not native. And that would be an example of an organism that's non-native. It's not spreading where we live in the southern U.S. You can form feral colonies here. If you didn't have a human helping the honeybee, it would die because it can't overwinter. But that would be a non-native organism that does have a benefit to human society. And so there's a lot of arguments that we should just be categorizing our non-native, our exotic invaders as those that have some sort of measurable economic or ecological impact on the community. Yeah. And then you get into microbes, and then it gets really confusing. So people in marine literature actually use completely different terminology to describe, like they have cryptic invaders, and there's a completely different literature to describe these organisms.
So how do you,
Yeah, and so what, if using a population, a type of population model, and so you have, whatever your intrinsic rate of increase is, so your estimate of R, and so it's not quite R in this model, but that would be, kind of like R. And then you have that in combination with dispersal, if you're assuming that you have dispersal from one property to another. So there's two things that are increasing population size, so whatever your birth balance to your death rate is, and then you also have dispersal coming in. And then you have one additional thing besides just natural death that can reduce population size, and that would be the removal of the invader. And so in the model, like people, and I didn't really talk about this, like you have your different management strategies, which would be collective management or independent, and each of those management strategies could choose among three different things. They can either eradicate it, so then you're trying to remove as fast as possible. You can try and control it, and in a lot of management situations, control is a better strategy than trying to eradicate. You get the largest net benefits, especially for things that don't spread quickly, because there's no benefit to you economically to remove it if it's not spreading quickly, bizarrely enough. And then the final thing, which in the economic world more, it seems like they call it adaption, but what we would call no control, you just give up. And so that's what happened with the independent management. It's just there's so much of the invader, and you're incurring such an economic cost to try and remove it, you just give up. And so those were kind of like the balances, like the removal plus natural death rates, and then the intrinsic rate of increase, and then dispersal.
I think we need to call it quits, but I invite you to come forward and ask your questions. But let's thank Dr. Irwin one more time.